The moment Ivanka Trump challenged Jasmine Crockett's faith during a live broadcast, you could hear a pin drop. But Jasmine's response ignited something that had the entire studio erupting in applause. The cameras captured every electric second. Brilliant studio lights flooded the panel table, casting everything in that artificial perfection that makes people forget how unforgiving it feels up close. The air held that familiar blend of hairspray and recycled conditioning that anyone who's stepped inside a television studio knows intimately. And then in the heart of what should have been routine policy discussion, Ivanka Trump settled back in her chair, folded her arms, and angled her head just enough to let a calculated smile emerge at the corner of her mouth. "Tell me, Jasmine," she started, her voice controlled but threaded with that intentional, rehearsed sweetness people deploy when they're preparing to strike. "How does your particular brand of religion mesh with the positions you champion politically? Seems like there's a disconnect, don't you think?" The statement lingered in the space around them. The host's smile wavered. One of the other panelists adjusted uncomfortably in their seat. The audience didn't exactly gasp, but a peculiar silence descended over the room like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for permission to exhale again. You could witness it in the faces behind the cameras, the way crew members caught each other's eyes without turning their heads too obviously. This wasn't policy debate anymore. This wasn't even about the original topic. This had become intimate, and it was happening live. Jasmine Crockett didn't react immediately. Her hands rested calmly on the table, fingertips lightly touching the wood surface. Her eyes stayed locked on Ivanka. Not with anger. That would have been too simple for the cameras to manipulate, but with something much quieter and more penetrating. She allowed the silence to extend just a moment longer, enough to make everyone watching lean in without realizing they were doing it. The host scrambled for a redirect. "Well, I think." Jasmine spoke over him, not loudly, not hurried, just with certainty. "You're asking me whether my faith and my politics can exist in the same space," she said, her tone steady. "I think the more important question is why anyone would assume they shouldn't." A subtle wave of murmurs rolled through the studio audience. Ivanka's smile stayed fixed, but her eyes shifted. A tiny movement just noticeable enough for anyone paying careful attention to catch. Jasmine continued, her voice unwavering as if she'd prepared for this moment throughout her entire life. "My faith isn't a marketing slogan. It isn't a talking point for election season. And it's not a stage prop to display when the cameras start rolling. My faith exists in how I treat people when there's nothing to gain from it. It's in whether I defend someone who's being attacked. It's in how I communicate when the person facing me doesn't vote like I do, look like I do, or worship like I do." A few audience members started clapping softly at first. The producer in the control booth didn't signal for commercial break. You could almost sense the crew realizing they were witnessing something electric. The kind of unplanned TV moment that no one orchestrates, but everyone remembers. Ivanka leaned forward now, a flash of frustration breaking through her polished composure. "I wasn't suggesting." "Yes, you were," Jasmine interrupted, still without elevating her voice. "You were suggesting that belief is only authentic if it comes wrapped in the same political packaging as yours. And if I don't satisfy that checklist, my faith doesn't qualify. That's the assumption I refuse to accept." Her words landed differently than rehearsed debate lines. They weren't crafted to score points. They were designed to reach somewhere deeper, somewhere that made people examine themselves. Even the camera operators, whose job requires staying detached, were watching with the kind of focus usually reserved for breaking news. The host attempted again to smooth the situation, but Jasmine didn't provide him the opportunity. She turned toward the audience, her gaze moving from one face to another like she was addressing each person individually. Belief is not about how prominently you can declare it on television. It's about whether your actions align with the values you profess to hold. That's it. Everything else is theater. The applause intensified this time, and it wasn't polite or tentative. It was the kind of clapping that emerges when people realize they've just heard something that will stay with them. Ivanka glanced down at her notes, and for a moment it appeared she was searching for a new approach, but the dynamic in the room had already transformed. The audience was with Jasmine now. The panelists were watching her, not the person who had tried to corner her. And somewhere in the back, the segment producer understood the clip would be circulating across social media before the next commercial break. But what led to this moment was more than a sharp exchange on live TV. It began long before the cameras ever went live. The day had started like any other for Jasmine Crockett when she had a major TV appearance scheduled. Early alarm, black coffee. A quick review of her talking points during the car ride. The segment was intended to be a policy roundtable on education reform and economic development. Nothing that suggested the kind of confrontation that would soon unfold. The network studio was located in Dallas, a location selected for its central accessibility, and the guests were a carefully balanced mixture. 2 conservatives, 2 progressives, and 1 neutral host who took pride in maintaining civility on air. Jasmine had been informed that Ivanka Trump would be positioned on the opposing side of the panel, which wasn't unusual. She'd encountered plenty of high-profile names before. Still, Ivanka's presence carried a different kind of gravity. Viewers didn't just see her as a political figure. She brought celebrity recognition, and that amplified every exchange. Backstage, the energy felt professional but strained. Assistants moved between dressing rooms. Makeup artists applied powder while the guests reviewed notes. Jasmine remembered glancing over and seeing Ivanka surrounded by her team. Her expression composed, her words measured and purposeful. She wasn't nervous. She looked like someone who already knew exactly how she intended to navigate the conversation. When they were summoned to the set, the walk through the corridor felt longer than it actually was. The studio itself was colder than it appeared on television. Bright spotlights overhead, reflective surfaces everywhere, and rows of audience members settling in. Jasmine took her seat at the left end of the table facing the host. Ivanka sat across from her with 2 other panelists positioned between them. The conversation began predictably enough. The host introduced everyone, outlined the topic, and turned to each guest for opening statements. Jasmine went first, her voice clear, her points concentrated on how educational opportunities directly impact the economy. She spoke about meeting parents in San Antonio who worked 2 jobs yet still struggled to locate a safe school for their children. About small business owners who couldn't hire locally because graduates lacked the necessary skills. Her examples were specific, grounded in real faces and actual conversations. Ivanka followed, pivoting quickly to her familiar talking points about private partnerships and innovative models for schools. Her delivery was polished. No stumbles, no unnecessary words. For the first 20 minutes, it was standard exchange of competing ideas with the occasional back-and-forth sparring that viewers expect from political television. But even then, there were moments that hinted at what was approaching. Whenever Jasmine spoke, Ivanka's eyes would linger just a second longer than necessary, as if studying her. Once or twice, she tilted her head slightly, a gesture that could be interpreted as curiosity or quiet judgment. Then, about halfway through the segment, the conversation shifted toward how personal values influence public decision-making. The host had intended it as a broad question for everyone. How do your principles shape your approach to these issues? But Jasmine's response brought an additional layer of vulnerability. She mentioned that her motivation came not just from her upbringing, but from a deep personal faith that guided how she treated others. She didn't make it about religion as policy. She made it about integrity as a person. It was here that something shifted in the atmosphere. Ivanka glanced briefly at the host, then leaned back in her chair. The other panelists went quiet, watching her in a way that suggested they sensed she was about to take the conversation somewhere unexpected. During the commercial break that followed, Nothing was spoken aloud, but there was a subtle tension. The panelists sipped water. Makeup artists stepped in to do quick touch-ups. Ivanka flipped a page in her notes without looking down at it. And Jasmine could feel eyes on her from the audience seats. When the cameras returned, the host was mid-sentence about bipartisanship. Jasmine answered a follow-up, and that's when Ivanka leaned forward, her voice cool and deliberate, and aimed her question at Jasmine's faith. For a split second, the studio froze, not in drama, but in that suspended way where everyone knows a boundary has just been crossed. This wasn't about debating policy anymore. It was about testing someone's identity in front of millions. But before the confrontation fully ignited, there was a moment in which Jasmine had to decide exactly how she would handle it, and every eye in the room was on her. It happened so quickly that some viewers at home might have thought it was scripted, but in the studio it felt like a sudden shift, the kind that tilts the entire balance of a conversation. Ivanka waited until Jasmine had finished making a point about fairness in public education. She nodded once as if acknowledging it, then leaned back in her chair. Her eyes stayed fixed on Jasmine, her expression neutral but sharpened with intent. "Tell me," Ivanka said, her voice steady but with that faint upward inflection that makes a question sound less like curiosity and more like a challenge. "How does your brand of religion fit with the things you stand for politically? Seems like a contradiction, don't you think?" The words didn't echo. There's no echo in a modern TV studio, but they landed with a weight that made everything else in the room pause. The audience members looked at each other. The panelists glanced down at their notes. Even the host hesitated, his eyes flickering between the two women like he was trying to decide if he should intervene. It wasn't just the question, it was the way she said brand of religion, not your faith or your beliefs. Those might have sounded respectful even in disagreement. But brand made it sound like a product, a label, something you could purchase, market, or discard if it didn't serve your agenda. Jasmine's lips pressed together for a moment. She didn't look away, but she also didn't rush to fill the silence. In those seconds, the energy in the room changed. People in the control booth leaned closer to their monitors. Camera operators adjusted their framing, anticipating that this could be the clip everyone would be discussing by evening. One of the other panelists, a former state legislator, shifted uncomfortably in his seat and glanced toward the host. The host opened his mouth, perhaps to soften the blow or redirect the conversation, but before he could, Ivanka added, "I mean, it's hard to reconcile, isn't it? Claiming deep faith while supporting policies that..." She trailed off, letting implication fill the gap. A soft, awkward laugh came from somewhere in the audience. It wasn't mocking, more the kind of laugh people make when they're unsure how else to react. Jasmine let out a slow breath. Not for the cameras, not for effect, but because she understood the trap in front of her. This wasn't just about answering a question. It was about how she would be seen in the moment, in the replay clips, in the endless social media conversations that would follow. She could go on the defensive, explain point by point why her faith aligned with her politics. Or she could attack back, throw the spotlight onto Ivanka's own contradictions. Both options carried risk. But Jasmine had learned long ago that the most powerful moments aren't always about having the perfect counterpunch. Sometimes they're about holding your ground so firmly that the other person has no choice but to shift. The silence stretched a beat longer. Ivanka's smile, if you could call it that, didn't change, but her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, as if she was waiting to see whether Jasmine would flinch. The host leaned forward slightly. "Congresswoman Crockett, would you like to respond?" His voice was calm, but there was a quiet urgency under it, like he was trying to hand her the floor before things spiraled further. Jasmine's hands stayed flat on the table. Her gaze didn't waver. "You're asking if my beliefs and my politics can exist together," she said evenly. "The better question is why you or anyone would assume they can't." A low murmur passed through the audience, It wasn't applause yet, but it was a sound of recognition, that sense people get when they've just heard a statement that cuts through pretense. Ivanka's head tilted slightly, like she was weighing her next words, but Jasmine had already shifted the focus. She didn't break her rhythm. Faith isn't a label you wear when it's convenient. It's in what you do when no one's watching. It's in how you treat people who have nothing to offer you. And it's in whether you stand for something even when it costs you. The host gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging the strength of the answer without stepping out of his neutral role. The audience began to clap softly at first, but with a tone that suggested they were ready for more. Ivanka opened her mouth to reply, but the control room signaled for a quick cutaway to graphics. The timing gave the exchange an edge. No immediate back and forth, just a pause that left Jasmine's words hanging in the air. But when the segment came back from that short break, Jasmine would have the chance to deliver her full response, and that's when everything shifted. When the red light on the camera blinked off for the commercial break, the studio seemed to exhale all at once. Audience members leaned toward each other, whispering in low tones. A stage hand in a black headset darted in to hand the host a fresh stack of cue cards. The other panelists shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact as if proximity to the tension might pull them into it. Jasmine stayed still, not frozen, not rattled, just still. She kept her hands on the table, fingertips lightly touching, and stared straight ahead while a makeup artist offered to dab at her forehead. She shook her head politely. Her mind wasn't on appearances right now. Across the table, Ivanka leaned toward one of her aides, murmuring something under her breath. The aide gave a short nod and stepped back toward the shadows. The way Ivanka carried herself in that moment was telling. She wasn't flustered, but there was a tightness in her jaw that hadn't been there before. The floor manager counted down from 10, his hands slicing through the air for emphasis. When the cameras came back, the host immediately tried to reset the tone. "We're discussing the intersection of values and public policy," he said, glancing between the two women as if he were physically holding the balance. Jasmine glanced at him briefly, then turned back to Ivanka. Her decision was made before the break was even over. She wasn't going to match snide with snide. She wasn't going to let the moment be reduced to a meme of two women snapping at each other. This was bigger than that, bigger than her, even. "I've been asked that kind of question before," Jasmine began, her voice steady but measured. "Not always in front of millions of people, but I've heard it. And I think the reason people ask it is because they've been taught to believe faith only looks one way, that there's a single mold, and if you don't fit it, yours isn't real." Her tone was conversational, but each sentence carried weight. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't filling the air just to avoid silence. The pauses between her words gave the audience time to absorb them. The camera angle shifted to Ivanka, whose lips pressed together in a polite, unreadable line. She tapped her pen once against her notepad. Not loudly enough to be picked up by the microphones, but the motion was there. "I grew up in a household where faith wasn't a performance," Jasmine continued. "It was in how you treated your neighbors, how you showed up for people when they needed you, even if you didn't get anything in return. It wasn't about using scripture as a sword to win arguments. It was about using it as a light to find your way, and sometimes to guide others who've lost theirs." That earned a few claps from the audience, though they quickly quieted again, leaning forward as if afraid to miss the next line. Ivanka shifted in her chair. "I didn't mean to question your—" "You did," Jasmine said, not unkindly but without softening. "And that's fine. We're here to talk. But if we're going to talk about belief, then let's be honest about what it means. Belief isn't loyalty to a party. It's loyalty to principles. If the party strays from those principles, your belief should stay where it is, with what's right." The host glanced toward the production booth, likely getting instructions through his earpiece, but for once he didn't interrupt. The moment was too clean, too direct to break. Jasmine looked to the audience again. The truth is, faith doesn't have to look like yours or mine. It doesn't need to be worn like a uniform. If it's real, it's already there in the way you live. And if you have to tear someone else down to prove yours, then maybe it's not faith you're defending. Maybe it's just pride. The room was quiet for a beat. Then applause swelled again, louder this time. You could see a few heads in the front row nodding slowly, almost in unison. The camera stayed wide, capturing both women. Ivanka looking composed but silent, Jasmine speaking with the same even cadence she had from the start. The host cleared his throat. "Congresswoman, thank you. Miss Trump, I'll give you the opportunity to respond after the break." The red light blinked off again, signaling another pause. Crew members moved quickly, but the energy in the room had shifted. Jasmine had taken the weight of Ivanka's remark and turned it into a moment that belonged entirely to her. But when the cameras returned, Jasmine wouldn't just defend her beliefs. She turned the conversation into a challenge that no one at the table or watching at home could easily sidestep. The second break ended faster than it felt. In the control room, producers knew they had something rare. The kind of exchange that didn't need dramatic music or flashy editing to keep viewers glued. When the cameras went live again, the host leaned in, his tone just a shade more careful than before. "Miss Trump, you were about to respond." Ivanka adjusted the cuff of her blazer before speaking. "I think it's important," she began, "to acknowledge that faith guides many people. But it also means holding ourselves accountable to those values. And when public officials claim to live by certain principles, the policies they support should reflect that. That's all I was saying." It was a neat reframing, polished, safe, and designed to sound reasonable without retracting the original sting. She offered a small, polite smile as if that settled the matter. Jasmine didn't take the bait. She didn't lean forward or raise her voice. Instead, she took a slow sip of water, set the glass down, and looked directly at Ivanka. "Accountability is something I welcome," she said evenly. "But accountability cuts both ways." The host shifted in his chair, sensing the current in the room change again. "I've never claimed to be perfect," Jasmine continued. "But I can tell you exactly where my values come from and how they show up in my work. You don't have to agree with my policies. That's part of democracy. What you can't do is decide that my beliefs aren't valid because they don't match yours." Ivanka opened her mouth, but Jasmine kept going. Not fast, not aggressive, just a steady current of words that didn't give space for interruption. "You talk about holding leaders accountable to their values. I agree. So let's talk about what that really looks like. Accountability means admitting when your side gets it wrong. It means standing up for what's right even if it costs you politically. It means showing compassion to people you'll never meet, not just those who can thank you publicly." The audience clapped again, a bit louder than before. The control room didn't try to mute it. "This isn't about religion as a brand," Jasmine said, glancing briefly at the camera before returning her gaze to Ivanka. "It's about whether you actually live the words you say you believe. If you can quote scripture but can't treat your neighbor with basic decency, then your issue isn't with me. It's with the faith you claim to represent." A man in the second row let out an audible "om-hom," and the mic picked it up just enough for viewers at home to hear. Ivanka's expression didn't break, but her pen had stopped moving across the page. For the first time, she didn't have an immediate comeback. The host, sensing an opening for broader discussion, turned to the other panelists. "Congresswoman brings up an interesting point about accountability across the board. How do we—" But Jasmine wasn't finished. She raised a hand slightly, not to silence him, but to signal she had one more thought. "Here's the truth," she said, her voice warming now. "Less about rebuttal and more about connection. Faith is not a trophy you put on a shelf to prove you've won something. It's a responsibility you carry every day in how you listen, how you serve, and how you speak to people who disagree with you. If it's real, it will challenge you to do better. And if it's not, it will give you excuses for why you don't have to. The applause this time wasn't tentative. It came fast and loud, spilling over the host's attempt to regain control. He let it go for a few seconds before finally speaking again. Well, that's certainly a perspective worth considering. The camera cut to a wide shot. Both women, the panelists, the audience. The contrast was stark. Ivanka composed but still, Jasmine visibly connected to the room. In the control booth, a producer whispered to another, "This is the clip, right here." And they were right. In less than a minute, Jasmine had moved from defending herself to challenging the very premise of the attack. She hadn't insulted Ivanka. She hadn't strayed into partisan jabs. She'd simply drawn a clear line and stood on it. But the real turning point was still to come, when Jasmine would take that line and use it to shift the entire conversation in her favor. The host tried to pivot the conversation toward a safer topic, something about bipartisan cooperation on infrastructure. But the momentum in the room was already leaning back toward the exchange between Jasmine and Ivanka. The audience wasn't here for road repair statistics anymore. They were locked on the tension, and Jasmine could feel it. She leaned slightly toward the microphone, not to interrupt, but to ease the conversation back where it needed to be. "Before we move on," she said, her tone still calm, "there's something I think we should clear up." The host gave her a nod, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the control room. "When people talk about faith in politics," Jasmine began, "they often do it in a way that's selective. They want it to count in some areas but not others. It's fine to talk about compassion when it's convenient, but when that compassion has to be extended to people they disagree with, suddenly the definition changes." Her words hung there for a moment. Then she turned her attention directly to Ivanka. "You've spoken publicly about your own beliefs. You've used them to frame arguments on policy, and you have every right to do that. But that right works both ways. You don't get to decide whose faith is real based on whether their politics match yours." Ivanka's chin lifted slightly. "I never said your faith wasn't real. I was questioning whether it aligns." "That's the point," Jasmine cut in, her voice still even but with a sharper edge now. "You're setting yourself up as the judge of whether my values align enough for my beliefs to count. That's not accountability, that's gatekeeping." A few gasps came from the audience, not loud but audible. Jasmine didn't stop there. And frankly, that's the problem with how religion is used in politics today. It's treated like a loyalty test instead of a guide for doing what's right. It's used to divide instead of unite. And it's wielded like a weapon to question the legitimacy of someone else's moral compass. The applause started in the middle rows this time, quick and deliberate, before spreading forward. The host waited, perhaps hoping it would fade on its own. It didn't. "You're making this personal," Ivanka said. "It is personal," Jasmine replied without hesitation. "When you question the sincerity of my beliefs on national television, that's personal. And when millions of people see that exchange, it reinforces the idea that there's only one acceptable way to believe, and that everyone else is suspect." She paused, scanning the audience before looking back at Ivanka. "That kind of thinking is dangerous. It's the same logic that's been used to marginalize entire communities, to deny people rights, to tell them they don't belong. And I'm not going to sit here and let it pass unchallenged." The applause swelled again, this time with cheers mixed in. The host tried to reassert control. "Ladies, I want to be sure. This isn't about me versus you," Jasmine said, turning toward him briefly. "It's about whether we can have a political conversation without weaponizing something as personal and sacred as faith." Her voice softened just slightly as she addressed the audience. "Look, we're all going to have different beliefs. That's what makes a country like ours strong, if we respect those differences. But respect means you don't question someone's sincerity just because their conclusions aren't the same as yours. Even the camera operator seemed to lean in now, framing tighter shots to capture every word. Ivanka sat back, lips pressed together, clearly weighing whether to respond immediately or let the moment pass. But before she could decide, the host announced another short break. The red light went off, and the chatter in the audience rose as crew members moved quickly around them. Jasmine sat quietly, her hands folded, her focus steady. She just shifted the conversation from a personal defense to a broader principle stand. And in doing so, she positioned herself not just as someone on the defensive, but as the one setting the terms of the debate. But the most dramatic shift was still ahead, when the audience itself would begin tipping the balance of the broadcast in Jasmine's favor. When the cameras came back after that break, the mood in the studio had noticeably changed. It wasn't anything the home audience could measure in numbers, but you could feel it in the way the crowd sat forward, in the small murmurs that seemed to rise whenever Jasmine moved to speak. The host reintroduced the panel and attempted to steer the conversation toward a new question about economic incentives for small businesses. But as soon as Jasmine's name was mentioned in passing, the audience erupted in applause, spontaneous, unprompted. It threw the timing off enough that the host had to wait for it to die down before continuing. Ivanka smiled politely, but the kind of polite smile that's meant to mask irritation. She adjusted her microphone and looked toward the audience as though she, too, might capture some of that energy. Yet when she began answering a question about entrepreneurship, the applause afterward was mild, polite. Nothing like the heat Jasmine's comments were generating. Halfway through the segment, the conversation drifted back to values in leadership. This wasn't planned. The host seemed almost wary of where it might go. But a question from one of the other panelists nudged it there naturally. Jasmine seized the opening. "I think the bigger question," she said, "is whether we're willing to apply our principles consistently, not just when it benefits our side, but when it costs us something." That line drew a longer round of clapping. The host glanced toward the control room, likely wondering if they should let it play or cut to a graphic, but kept the cameras rolling. In the front row, a woman in a navy blazer stood and called out, "That's right." It wasn't disruptive. It felt more like an echo of the room's mood. Jasmine acknowledged her with a nod before continuing. "When I was a public defender," she said, "I didn't get to pick and choose whose rights I defended. That's not how justice works. And faith, to me, works the same way. If it only applies to people who already think like you, it's not faith, it's favoritism." That one landed hard. Applause, cheers, even a few whistles filled the air. Ivanka straightened her papers and smiled again. But the moment had shifted beyond her reach. The audience wasn't hostile toward her. They just weren't with her in the same way anymore. The warmth, the connection, it was pooling around Jasmine now. The host gave Ivanka the floor. She responded with a carefully measured line about unity and respecting differences. But as soon as she finished, there was a pause. The kind of pause that happens when a room is waiting to see if the energy will rise again. It didn't. A few claps, a murmur. Nothing close to the response Jasmine had been drawing. When the next question came her way, Jasmine leaned slightly forward, her tone conversational. "I think people can disagree on policy all day long," she said. "But what we can't afford is to doubt each other's humanity. The moment we start doing that, we've already lost the thread of what this country is supposed to be about." The applause this time was thunderous. Even the host couldn't help but smile. In the control booth, one of the producers turned to another and said quietly, "She's running this segment now." And she was, not by dominating the time, but by holding the audience in a way no one else on that stage could. In that moment, Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply let the reaction settle before adding, "If your faith, whatever it looks like, can't make room for someone else's dignity, then maybe it's not the other person's belief that needs questioning." A cameraman who had been shooting live panels for over a decade muttered under his breath. That's the pull quote right there. By now, the applause had become almost rhythmic. Whenever she hit a line that resonated, the room responded without hesitation. The segment wasn't about policy anymore. It had become about character, conviction, and the kind of leadership people wanted to see. The host glanced at the clock and announced that they'd take one final break before closing thoughts. The red light on the camera blinked off again, but the chatter in the audience didn't quiet the way it usually did. People were leaning toward each other, discussing what they'd just heard. Some even pulled out their phones to type furiously. But the final act on air would seal it and leave Ivanka without a clean way to regain the ground she'd lost. When the cameras lit back up for the final segment, the control room had one priority: keep things tight. The back and forth between Jasmine and Ivanka had already stretched the planned schedule, and producers knew they'd have to cut other topics to make room. But no one complained. This was the kind of television that carried itself. The host began with a polite wrap-up question to all the panelists. In 30 seconds or less, what's one guiding value you think leaders should hold above all else? It was meant to be quick, a tidy way to tie up loose ends. One by one, the panelists answered. The former state legislator spoke about transparency. The economist beside Jasmine emphasized fiscal responsibility. Then it was Ivanka's turn. She folded her hands neatly on the table, her expression composed. I believe the most important value is integrity, she said. It means standing by what you say, but also ensuring your actions match your words. It's about consistency, no matter who's watching. There was polite applause. She glanced briefly at Jasmine as the host shifted his gaze to the congresswoman. Jasmine didn't rush. She looked at the audience first, scanning the rows as if weighing each face before speaking. For me, the most important value is compassion, she said, because without it, every other principle can be twisted to justify harm. Compassion forces you to see people as more than their political identity. It keeps you honest. It keeps you human. The clapping began almost immediately, louder than any reaction so far that evening. The host leaned forward to wrap the segment, but Jasmine wasn't finished. And here's the thing, she continued, her voice steady. If compassion is real, it doesn't care about party lines. It doesn't shrink when the cameras are off, and it doesn't get to exclude people because they believe differently. That's where faith, my faith, sits. And if that's a contradiction to someone, maybe it's worth asking why. The audience erupted, not just with applause, but with cheers that carried over the host's attempts to speak. In the control room, the producers made a split-second call. Let it run. Ivanka kept her face neutral, but the live feed caught the briefest flicker in her eyes, the kind that betrays recognition that the ground has shifted for good. She didn't try to interject. The applause would have drowned her out anyway. The host eventually regained the floor. Thank you to all our guests tonight, he said, smiling a little more toward Jasmine than the others. That's all the time we have. The red light went off. Cameras lowered. In most broadcasts, this is the moment where the tension diffuses, replaced by handshakes and small talk. But here, the air still held that sharp charge of something that mattered. Audience members stood to leave, several stopping to shake Jasmine's hand as they passed. A middle-aged man in a baseball cap told her, "You said what a lot of us have been feeling for a long time." A young woman in a blazer simply mouthed, "Thank you," as she walked by. Ivanka stayed seated, flipping through her notes as her team gathered around her. She wasn't avoiding Jasmine, but she also wasn't seeking her out. One of the floor producers approached Jasmine. "That last answer, it's already trending," he said quietly, holding up his phone to show her a live feed of clips being shared online. Thousands of retweets, comments pouring in. Jasmine gave a small smile, not gloating but acknowledging the weight of it. She hadn't come here to win an argument, but she had made her point. And more importantly, she'd made people listen. As she walked off the stage, her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. Texts from colleagues, friends, and even a few political opponents she respected. One message stood out. "You just gave the best defense of faith I've heard in years, and you didn't make it about politics." Back in the control booth, a senior producer turned to his assistant and said, "This clip's going to have legs. We'll be seeing it for days." But what happened once that clip hit the internet was beyond anything the network or Jasmine could have predicted. By the time Jasmine slid into the back seat of the black sedan waiting outside the studio, her phone was buzzing nonstop. The driver, a quiet man with silver hair and a pressed uniform shirt, glanced in the rear-view mirror. "Something big happened in there?" he asked. She gave a small laugh, shaking her head. "You could say that." It wasn't until they pulled away from the building that she finally unlocked her phone. The first notification that caught her eye was from a journalist she knew in Austin. "That was surgical. Can we get you on for a follow-up tomorrow?" Another came from a producer at a late-night talk show, asking if she'd be willing to appear in person. But the real story was on social media. The clip of her exchange with Ivanka, specifically the part where she said, "If your faith can't make room for someone else's dignity, then maybe it's not faith you're defending," had been posted by a political commentator within minutes of the broadcast ending. From there, it spread like wildfire. In under an hour, it had been shared by thousands of accounts. Church leaders praising her clarity, activists calling it the line of the year, and everyday people posting comments like, "Finally, someone said it. And this is how you answer without lowering yourself." In her seat, Jasmine scrolled through reactions, pausing when she saw a video stitched together by a viewer. The moment Ivanka asked her question, followed by Jasmine's pause, then the response in full, ending with the audience's standing applause. The caption read simply, "Grace under fire." Meanwhile, news sites were already running headlines. Congresswoman Crockett shuts down faith question from Ivanka Trump on live TV. Viral exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Ivanka Trump dominates social media. Panel discussion turns personal, and one lawmaker's calm response wins the room. It wasn't just political corners talking about it. Lifestyle bloggers, faith-based organizations, even a few celebrity accounts shared the clip, many adding their own thoughts on what leadership should look like. By the time Jasmine got home, the number of views had crossed 5 million, and that was just on one platform. Cable news networks were replaying the exchange, each with their own spin. Some praised her composure. Others questioned whether Ivanka's comment had been taken out of context. But either way, the conversation was hers now. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, phone propped up against a small ceramic jar. Texts kept coming in, some from old friends she hadn't heard from in years, others from people she'd never met. One stood out, from a pastor in Kansas City. "Thank you for reminding people that faith isn't a political tool. We needed to hear that tonight." Jasmine typed back, "We all need to hear it sometimes." By late evening, the moment had taken on a life of its own. A well-known musician tweeted the clip with a caption, "This is how you hold the line without raising your voice." A popular podcast dedicated an emergency episode to breaking it down. Hashtags with her name were trending in multiple states. In the swirl of it all, Jasmine didn't miss the irony. She hadn't gone into that studio looking for a viral moment. She'd gone in to talk policy. But the personal challenge had created something more. A chance to show people how to stand firm without turning bitter. She thought back to the audience's reaction in real time, the way the energy in the room had shifted, the sudden connection that grew each time she spoke plainly. It wasn't about theatrics, it was about authenticity, and people could feel it. Sitting back in her chair, she realized the conversation was no longer just about her and Ivanka. It was about the broader question she'd raised. What does it really mean to live by your beliefs? And that question was now ricocheting far beyond one televised debate. But before the night was over, Jasmine would reflect on the moment in her own words, offering a lesson that turned a tense exchange into something lasting. The next morning, sunlight cut through the blinds in Jasmine's living room, waking her before her alarm. Her phone was still on the kitchen counter, face down, but she could tell it hadn't stopped buzzing through the night. She made coffee first, strong black, before sitting down and finally turning it over. Her notifications were stacked in endless columns. Interview requests, invitations to podcasts, emails from editors asking for an op-ed. One message was from a high school civics teacher in Spokane who had shown her clip to his class. "We talked about what it means to disagree without demeaning. You gave them an example they'll remember." That one stayed with her. Jasmine opened her laptop and began typing a short statement. Not to fan the flames, but to close the loop in her own words. She kept it simple. Faith is not a competition. It's a daily commitment to act with compassion, even toward those who see the world differently. If yesterday's conversation reminded people of that, then I'm grateful for the opportunity. Let's remember we can challenge ideas without questioning each other's humanity. Within minutes, the post was being shared as widely as the clip itself. Commentators called it classy, measured, and exactly what was needed. Later that day, she sat for an interview with a local radio host in San Antonio. The host asked if she'd been prepared for Ivanka's question. Jasmine laughed softly. "I don't think you can ever really prepare for someone questioning something so personal. But you can decide in advance how you'll carry yourself when it happens." "Which is?" the host pressed. "To tell the truth without turning it into a fight," Jasmine replied. "Because fights end. Truth sticks." Back at her office, her staff was buzzing. Not just about the media attention, but about the flood of emails from constituents. Many were from people who didn't share her politics, but respected how she'd handled herself. A retired Army chaplain wrote, "I disagreed with nearly every policy point you made last night, but I respect the way you stood firm without disrespecting your opponent." That's rare these days. For Jasmine, that was the real win. By evening, as she finally allowed herself to close the laptop, she thought about what the moment meant beyond headlines. Yes, it had gone viral. Yes, it had boosted her profile. But the deeper takeaway was that people still responded to grace under pressure. They still valued someone who could defend themselves without stripping someone else's dignity away. She poured herself another cup of coffee and stared out the window. Somewhere out there, viewers who'd never heard of her before last night were replaying the exchange, talking about it with friends, maybe even rethinking what they expected from public figures. That mattered. In the end, she knew she'd remember the quiet after the applause more than the noise itself. The split second when she realized she'd turned what could have been a personal attack into a conversation people actually wanted to have. Her reflection wasn't complicated. The lesson was the same one she'd carried since her earliest days in public service. You don't control what people throw at you, but you control how you respond. And sometimes your response can open more doors than the perfect speech ever could. Before shutting down for the night, she typed one more post, this time directly to the people who'd been watching. If this conversation meant something to you, remember this. We can speak truth without cruelty, stand firm without arrogance, and hold to our values without using them as weapons. That's not weakness, that's leadership. She hit send, knowing full well it might not get as many shares as the viral clip. But she didn't care. That post was for the people who'd actually heard her, not just watched the exchange for sport. Then, with the house quiet and her phone finally on silent, she sat back in her chair, a small, tired smile crossing her face. The lights of the city flickered beyond her window, and she thought, not for the first time, that the real work wasn't in winning a moment on television. It was in what you did with the moment after. If you believe in leading with compassion, in listening before judging, and in protecting each other's dignity, no matter where you stand politically. Subscribe, stay engaged, and keep showing up for these conversations. They matter more than we think.